Tonight we're not stepping into the halls of kings or the towers of knights. Instead, we drift toward the dim, forgotten corners of the map into a world that didn't wear crowns or carve names into history books. A place where the stories are softer, smaller, and infinitely more real. We're talking about medieval peasants, about those who endured not by the sword but by the shovel, who fought no wars but survived more battles than we could ever imagine against plague, against hunger, against cold, against the long weight of silence that pressed on them each day. There is a certain comfort in slowness, in listening to the quiet echoes of lives once lived far from the pages of fame. So if this kind of calm, dusty storytelling brings you rest, settle in. Dim the lights, pull a blanket close, and let your mind drift far back to a time before clocks, before cities, before names meant anything at all. The village has no name, or maybe it once did, but the name wore away with the wind like everything else. It sits nestled in a shallow dip of land, not deep enough to be a valley, not wide enough to be a plain. It lies somewhere in the middle of nowhere, not metaphorically, but truly geographically nowhere. No maps mark it, no roads lead to it. It is a soft crease in the earth hidden between the folds of time. You've lived here all your life and you will die here. From the doorstep of your cottage to the edge of the fields, perhaps 60 steps, maybe less. You've never counted. There are 12, maybe 15 families here, depending on the season, depending on the year, depending on who made it through the last winter. Everyone knows everyone. Every face, every cough, every grumble of hunger and prayer for rain. The homes are not houses as we know them. They slouch against the weather like old men. Their walls are made of wattle and daub, a mix of mud, straw and sticks packed tightly enough to keep the wind out, but never enough to keep the cold from seeping in. The roofs sag under their own weight, draped in thatch that is more hole than cover by now. They leak, and always in the same places right above your sleeping spot or where the pot hangs. The air smells of smoke and wool, of damp rot and livestock. You don't notice anymore. The smell is the smell of living. It's always there, like your breath, like the ache in your back. Outside, the forest stands thick and still. Trees older than memory ring the village like a wall. You don't go into the forest unless you have to, and even then you ask permission from no one in particular, just the trees themselves. You walk softly and never linger. There is a track that leads into the village, but to call it a road would be kind. It's just a pair of muddy grooves carved by ox carts and boots, more puddle than path. No travellers pass through, no merchants, no lords. If a stranger ever arrives, the village will whisper about them for a month. Are they cursed? Are they blessed? Do they smell of salt or speak with a strange tongue? Either way, no one leaves. Not really. Not unless something goes terribly wrong. You've heard stories of cities, of places where buildings stretch 2 stories high and streets are paved with stone, but those are fairy tales. You don't miss what you've never seen. What you have is here, and here is enough. Time here is not measured in minutes or hours. There are no clocks, no bells, unless the wind carries the sound of one from a chapel far away. You measure time in shadows, in aches, in hunger. Morning arrives when the light does, night when the light fades. The space in between is for work, always work. You tend the fields, not your fields, of course. The land belongs to the Lord, a man you've never met and probably never will. You work it because your father did and his father before him. Because that's how things are. You owe labour. You owe grain. You owe deference. In exchange, you get a place to stand and a patch of earth to grow turnips. The soil is thin and hard. You coax what you can from it, barley, cabbage, beans if you're lucky. Every growing season is a gamble, every frost a thief. When the harvest is good, you smile a little more. When it's bad, you tighten your belt and hope next year will be kinder. The stew gets thinner. The bread gets smaller, you get quieter. The well stands in the middle of the village. It gives water when it wants to. Some years it runs dry in August and you carry buckets farther than your knees prefer, but it's what you have. You make do. Everyone does. Children are born here and they cry the same way every baby does. They are wrapped in wool and laid in straw. They grow quickly, too quickly. Childhood is short work begins early. By 6 or 7 they're herding geese fetching water stirring pots. By 12 they're bending over fields like the rest of us. No time for dreams, only duties. There's no school. No one teaches you to read. Words are strange markings the priest knows, but you don't need them. You learn from hands, from watching, from listening. How to tie a knot, how to patch a roof, how to tell when the sky's about to break open with rain. These are the lessons that matter. The village elder, a man named Tom, is not much wiser than the rest, but once he spoke with a monk and that seems to count for something. His goat is still alive. His walls haven't fallen down. That's enough to make him the closest thing to a leader anyone wants. Disputes are rare, and when they happen, they're settled with shrugs and bread. You take turns being right. You remember who helped you last winter, and you try to return the favour before the frost comes again. There is no currency here, only memory. Holidays come with feast days if there's anything to feast on. Weddings, births, and deaths. The same muddy path fills with laughter or tears. The same rough benches pulled from the same huts. Music, if there is any, is played on pipes or hummed in low voices. The lyrics don't matter. The rhythm is what counts. You don't talk about the future. You talk about the weather. You talk about how the goat hasn't been milking much, about how the stew tasted better last year. You tell stories, not big ones, but small ones, like the time a chicken flew into the fire or when old Marjorie scolded a cow and it listened. These are the legends of your world, and at night you sit by the hearth smoke curling toward the rafters. The fire gives just enough heat to chase the chill. You stare into it and think of nothing, or maybe everything. Your back hurts, your hands are cracked, but there is bread on the table and water in the pot. That's enough. You don't ask for more, not because you don't want it, but because wanting is dangerous. It makes you notice what you don't have, and that's a pain no poultice can cure, so you carry on. You patch the roof. You mend the fence. You plant the barley and hope it rises. You hold your child when they cry. You kiss your wife's fingers when they bleed. You bow your head when the priest passes, even if you're not sure what his words mean. You live in circles, but circles still move. And through it all, through hunger and frost, through aching knees and silent nights you endure, not with glory, not with pride, but with a kind of strength that doesn't need to be seen to be real, because that more than anything is what it meant to be a peasant in the Middle Ages. You lived, and that was enough. The days of a medieval peasant were long, slow, and stitched together by repetition. Not the comforting repetition of a favourite song or a well-worn path, but the kind that grinds into your bones until your body starts to hum with the rhythm of labour. From the moment the first light slid across the wooden shutters to the moment the last ember in the hearth gave up its glow, your time was spoken for. You rose with the sun, not because you were eager, but because there was no choice. The rooster crowed sometimes too early, sometimes too late, but it didn't matter. The cold air crept into your blanket long before the sun did. You could ignore the sound, but you couldn't ignore the ache in your back or the silence of an empty stomach. So you stood up slowly, stretching muscles that never really stopped hurting. There was no breakfast, not in the way we imagine it now. If you were lucky, the stew from last night had thickened enough to be called a meal. If you were less lucky, there was only bread hard, dark and dry, torn into pieces and dipped into warm water to soften. There was no rush. Eating fast didn't get you more food, only less time to pretend you were full. Once the food or the idea of food was done, you stepped outside. The village didn't have streets, just paths worn into the mud by centuries of boots and hooves. The frost clung to the edges of every thatched roof, glittering in the morning light like broken glass. You didn't notice. You had chores. Every adult worked. Every child who could lift a bucket or chase a chicken worked. There were no days off, no weekends, no breaks, because you were tired or sick or sad. The field didn't care, and neither did the animals. The barley needed sowing. The goats needed milking. The fence needed mending. There was always something. You started in the fields. You didn't own them, but they owned you. Bent over with a hoe or scythe, you moved with the rhythm of 1,000 others who had come before. The earth was hard in spring, cruel in winter, generous only when it felt like it, and you gave everything to it. Your time, your strength, your skin. Calluses weren't a mark of pride. They were just what happened when you never stopped holding tools. You worked alongside your neighbours, not chatting, not laughing. There wasn't energy for that. Just the sound of breath of blades in dirt of the wind moving across the land like a sigh. Sometimes someone sang usually an old song with words no one really understood anymore. You sang not for joy, but to forget the pain in your arms. The children helped where they could. They carried water in wooden pails that leaked at the seams. They herded geese with sticks and shouts. They learned quickly, not because anyone taught them, but because they watched. There were no lessons, no chalkboards, just experience passed from hand to hand. Midday came without ceremony. You wiped sweat with the sleeve. You sat on a stone or the edge of a furrow. If you had food, you ate. Bread again, maybe a piece of cheese if a cow had been kind. You didn't talk about your dreams. You talked about the weather, whether the frost would hold, whether the clouds meant rain or just another cold wind. After lunch, if you could call it that, there was more work. The Lord's fields needed tending too. His land came before yours. That was the rule. You owed him labour days and days of it. And he didn't ask politely. His steward arrived with his tally stick and his quill marking who had shown up and who hadn't. If you missed a day, he remembered. If you spoke out of turn, he remembered that too. The steward never smiled. He didn't need to. His power wasn't in kindness, it was in the book he carried, and the names he could cross out. You didn't fear him exactly, but you stayed out of his way. You bowed your head. You did your part. And when he left, you exhaled. By the time the sun began to dip behind the hills, your body had begun to hum with pain again. Not sharp pain, just the kind that settles into your joints and stays there like an old friend who never leaves. You returned home slowly, your steps dragging. The fields fell behind you like a curtain dropping on a play. The cottage welcomed you with smoke and the faint scent of boiling herbs. Inside, the air was thick with warmth and the quiet sounds of home. A pot on the fire, a child coughing in the corner, a goat shifting near the door. You didn't own much. A wooden bench, maybe a stool, a single table made from rough boards, a chest for your clothes if you were lucky. Your possessions were not precious, but they were necessary. A knife, a spoon, a pot that had been patched so many times it looked more like a story than a tool. Dinner was the same as breakfast. Stew, bread, a cup of ale if the barley harvest had been decent. You didn't eat with etiquette, you ate with purpose. Hands tore bread, spoons dipped. No one spoke much. Words used energy. Energy was for tomorrow. After the meal, there was no entertainment. No books, no music beyond a lullaby hummed to a baby, or the crackling of the fire. You sat in silence, watching the flames, listening to the wind letting the weight of the day settle. The children curled together like puppies. The elders nodded off. You sat still until the stillness became sleep. Night in a medieval village wasn't quiet. It was filled with the sounds of breathing, of snoring, of animals shifting, of wind squeezing through cracks in the wall. It was filled with dreams strange and vivid. Some you forgot by morning, some you carried for weeks, and then the rooster crowed, and the ache returned, and the cycle began again. This was life, not dramatic, not heroic, but enduring. Not a story of triumph, but of persistence. You didn't ask for much, just a day without pain, a night without leaks, a meal that made you feel full even for a moment, and still somehow you managed to smile now and then, to sing, to kiss your child's forehead, to pull a friend out of the mud, to laugh when the goat got into the cabbage. Because even in a world that asked so much of you, you found small ways to say, "I'm still here," and sometimes that was enough. You lived your entire life in a place that most maps never bothered to name, but that didn't mean your world was small, not to you. It was just deeply known, intimately carved into your memory like grooves on a wooden bowl worn from daily use. You didn't measure life by distance or novelty. You measured it by familiarity, by the stretch between your doorstep and the edge of the fields, by the angle of the sun hitting the church spire on a feast day by the time it took to walk to the stream and back with a full bucket. The village was everything. It was your home, your history, your trap, and your comfort. It sat nestled in a dip in the land far from major roads, and well beyond the interest of anyone with a title. The fields surrounded it like a patchwork quilt, irregular, stubborn, hard-earned. They weren't organised the way you might expect, neatly boxed and signed, but sprawling and informal. Some had names: Widow's Acre, the Lower Strip, 3 Stone Row. Not because anyone had written them down, but because someone once said it and everyone else just kept saying it. There were no fences, only memories. "That patch there is mine," someone would say, pointing vaguely past a willow tree. "Been mine since my grandfather's grandfather." You didn't argue. You knew better. Disputes weren't settled with lawyers or maps. They were settled with shrugs, muttered apologies, and sometimes a shared jug of ale. On rare occasions it came to shouting. Once, maybe twice a fight. But the next morning you still had to plough next to the same man. So forgiveness came quicker than pride. The village had no government, no bureaucracy, no elections. Leadership was more rumour than role. The oldest man, or at least the one who looked like he should be the oldest, often became the one others consulted. Not because he was always wise, but because no one else wanted the responsibility. If you'd once spoken to a monk or a merchant, you were considered a scholar. If your goat didn't die during the last frost, you were considered lucky. That was as close to authority as most people ever got. Your community was small, but never anonymous. Everyone knew everyone's name. Everyone knew everyone's secrets, though they pretended not to. If someone's daughter vanished for 3 days, people whispered. If someone's field looked greener than it should, people speculated. But gossip, like the weather, was part of the rhythm. It passed over and through and was usually forgotten by the next feast day. And speaking of feast days, they mattered. They were your calendar. The only real markers of time in a year that otherwise blurred together in a smear of labour and smoke. Candlemas, Michaelmas, All Saints. Days when the rhythm shifted just slightly. You still worked, but maybe not as much. Maybe you wore your cleaner tunic. Maybe there was music. Maybe someone roasted a bird. Children grew up fast, not because they were pushed, but because life didn't leave them much choice. By the age of 7, they were helping in the fields, minding animals, patching roofs. They learned by watching, by doing, by failing. There was no schoolhouse, no books, no lessons, just a slow layering of skill through repetition. A child might not know how to spell barley, but they could tell you which rows grew best and when to plant them. Girls learned to cook, to sew, to carry water without spilling it. Boys learned to carve, to tether, to swing a scythe without slicing their foot. But these roles weren't rigid. If a boy could bake better than his mother, no one stopped him. If a girl could mend a fence faster than her brothers, she did. Talent was more valuable than tradition when every hand mattered. Love in the way we think of it now wasn't the centerpiece of marriage. Unions were practical, strategic, sometimes arranged, sometimes not. You married because the seasons demanded it, because you needed help on the land, because two bodies could accomplish more than one, because survival rarely made room for poetry. But that didn't mean love never grew. Sometimes it did quietly, like moss on stone. Other times it didn't, and you learned to live around the gap. Weddings were village-wide events, not extravagant but festive in their own right. Bread was shared. Music was played on whatever could be plucked or struck. The wine, if any, was sour and limited. The dancing was simple and joyful. The bride wore flowers, the groom wore nerves, and the whole village watched not out of formality, but because they had nothing better to do. Funerals, on the other hand, were solemn, short, and deeply communal. When someone died, bells tolled if there were bells, if not, people gathered anyway. There were prayers in Latin words no one understood, but everyone felt. The body was buried quickly wrapped in linen if there was any to spare. The grave was marked with wood or a stone or sometimes just memory. "He's near the old elm," someone would say, and that was enough. You feared death, but not in the way we do now. It wasn't a foreign idea. It was as close to you as the frost. You expected it. You planned for it. You talked about it quietly with the same tone you'd used to discuss rain. Someday it would come, and until then you had work to do. But life, despite its grimness, had moments of real joy. A child's first steps, a cow giving birth, a full harvest, a song hummed during weaving, a smile exchanged over a shared meal. These weren't grand moments, but they were yours, and they sustained you. You knew the land better than you knew yourself. You knew where the soil stayed damp after rain, where the wind caught the edge of the ridge, just so where the mushrooms like to grow in early spring. You read the earth like a book written in footsteps and furrows. And when the sun sank low behind the hills, casting gold across the rooftops, and turning the smoke from hearths into lazy ribbons of light, you felt perhaps only briefly that this hard, narrow life was enough. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. There were no illusions, no fantasies, just the certainty of dirt, of sky, of the same hands holding the same tools your parents once did. You were part of a chain unbroken, stretching backward beyond memory and forward beyond hope. And even if your name would never be written down, your life was not forgotten. Not by the wind that passed through your fields, not by the soil that held your footprints. You belonged here, in the village, in the rhythm, in the quiet persistence of people who woke each day and did what needed doing. It wasn't glorious, but it was human, and that in its own way was sacred. The village may have seemed still quiet, timeless, but underneath that stillness was movement endless and exhausting. The life of a medieval peasant didn't pause. It didn't slow down. It pressed forward season after season with a rhythm set not by clocks or kings, but by the needs of the land, and that rhythm shaped every aspect of your existence. Each day began not with an alarm, but with light. The moment the first grey glow crept through the shutters, or more often through the cracks in the walls, you were up. Not because you were eager, but because there was simply no alternative. Morning didn't ask for permission. The animals stirred, the hearth called for kindling. The tasks of the day lined up silent and insistent. You started by checking the fire. If it had gone out in the night, you had to coax it back from embers or beg a hot coal from a neighbour. Fire wasn't just warmth. It was life. It cooked your food, dried your clothes, lit your evenings. Without it, you were a little colder, a little hungrier, a little more alone. Keeping the fire going was both a skill and a responsibility. Breakfast, if it could be called, that wasn't a meal, it was an attempt. A piece of bread may be hardened from the day before, a bit of pottage if it had survived the night. Something hot if you were lucky, something at all if you weren't. You ate quickly, sitting on a bench or a stool or the edge of your sleeping mat. No ceremony, no pause, just fuel. Then came the work. It was never glamorous and rarely varied. You knew your tasks as well as you knew your breath. Feed the animals, collect the eggs, patch the roof, turn the soil, mend the tools, haul the water, stack the firewood. If you had a field, it came first. If you had animals, they came second. If the well was dry or the wind had blown down the fence again, you adjusted. Your plans didn't matter much. The day dictated its own schedule, and the day was long. In summer, the sun hung overhead for hours, baking the fields and your shoulders. You sweated through rough wool, bent low over rows of barley or beans, squinting against the glare. In winter, the light was brief and pale, your breath clouding in front of you as you shoveled snow or chopped ice from the well. There was no comfort in either, only different shades of hard. Children worked too. Not because anyone forced them to, but because no one could afford for them not to. A 7-year-old might carry water. A 10-year-old might lead the sheep. By 12, you were expected to pull your weight. By 15, you were probably married or close to it. Childhood as we know it now didn't exist. Life demanded too much. Women's work didn't end when the men left the house. It simply shifted focus. They churned butter, spun thread, made soap, brewed ale. They watched the children cook the meals, dried herbs, gathered fuel. They patched clothing until the fabric was more patched than original. They tended the sick with knowledge passed down like recipes, plantain leaves for burns, garlic for coughs, yarrow for bleeding. Their labour was constant, often invisible, but absolutely essential. If you were lucky, you had tools simple, sturdy, handed down through generations. A wooden plough, an iron hoe, a sickle with a blade worn to a curve so smooth it almost sang. These weren't just objects, they were lifelines. When a handle snapped or a blade chipped, it wasn't a minor annoyance, it was a disaster. Repairs took time, skill, and materials you might not have. So you cared for your tools like they were family, sharpened them, oiled them, hid them from the rain. Lunch, if it happened at all, was brief. A crust of bread, a sliver of cheese, a mug of small beer. You didn't sit down so much as lean, against a fence post, against a tree, just long enough to let the weight leave your legs before you picked it up again. The afternoon stretched, shadows lengthened. Your body ached. The work never felt done, just postponed. You didn't finish. You paused. That was the difference. Sometimes you found small moments of rest. A conversation over the fence. A joke whispered between rows of rye. A song hummed while washing clothes in the stream. These weren't luxuries. They were survival mechanisms. A way to make the unbearable just barely bearable. You didn't laugh because life was funny. You laughed because the alternative was worse. By dusk, the village gathered itself again. People trickled home. Doors creaked. Smoke rose. You fed the animals one last time, checked the fence line, closed the shutters, watered the herbs. Then you returned to the hearth and the rhythm softened. Dinner was much like breakfast, but warmer. The same pot of stew, the same bread, the same faces around the same fire. You didn't expect variety. You hoped for enough. Conversation was muted, half from exhaustion, half from routine. You talked about the weather, the crops, the neighbour's pig. Not because there was nothing else to say, but because those things mattered. Truly mattered. Sometimes you sang. Not always, not well. But someone would start a tune and others would join in. Songs about saints, about lost loves, about fields and rivers and horses and death. Songs that no one had written but everyone remembered. You went to sleep early, not because you were disciplined, but because there was nothing else. No light, no entertainment, just the dim glow of coals and the pull of fatigue. You didn't undress, you didn't change. You lay down as you were boots on tunic-stiff shoulders sore. You curled around warmth, another body, a hunk of wool, a dreaming dog. And sleep came in two waves. First sleep, then a brief waking in the middle of the night, then second sleep. You didn't question it. That's just how it worked. If you woke during the dark hours, you tended the fire, used the chamber pot, whispered a prayer, then lay back down and waited for sleep to take you again. You dreamed of better harvests, of dry boots, of warm stew and roofs that didn't leak. Sometimes you dreamed of things you didn't even understand, places you'd never seen, faces you didn't recognize. But most often you dreamed of your own life just a little softer, just a little easier. And then before you were ready, the light returned. Another day, another round, another turn of the wheel, and you did it again, not because you loved it, but because you had no choice, because that was life, because that was enough. In the medieval countryside, time was not something you could hold in your hand. You couldn't check it on a wristwatch or hear it click by on a clock tower. It moved differently. It was not precise, but it was present, woven into the rhythm of your days, your crops, your aches. You measured time not in hours, but in shadows, in seasons, in the colour of the fields. Your calendar was the land. Spring wasn't a date. It was the moment the ground softened enough for your fingers to dig. Summer wasn't a solstice. It was the week when everything needed weeding all at once and your back felt like it might snap in half. Autumn was marked by the smell of ripe fruit and the sound of scythes. Winter wasn't just cold. It was slow. It was silence. It was hunger pressing behind every breath. The seasons dictated everything, what you wore, what you ate, when you worked and when you paused. Even your mood was shaped by the light. Spring brought nervous hope. Summer brought sweat and bruises. Autumn brought satisfaction if you were lucky or dread if you weren't. Winter brought the reckoning. There was no day off. The fields did not respect Sundays. Rain didn't care about feast days. Still, the church tried to impose its own rhythm. Mass on Sundays, holy days, festivals, saints' days. The priest's bell tried to structure your life, but the wind and the mud had their own schedule. You bowed your head in prayer, but your mind often wandered back to the firewood that still needed chopping. And yet time passed, in small repetitive loops. You knew it not by change, but by wear. Your clothes thinned, your tools dulled, your hands cracked, your children grew, your parents shrank. Each year looked like the last, but slightly more faded. If you were a child in this world, your sense of time was taught to you through action. Not through school, because there was no school. Not through stories, because most people couldn't read them. You learned through repetition, through doing, through helping your mother sweep the hearth, through watching your father sharpen a ploughshare, through fetching water again and again until you could do it without spilling a drop. There were milestones. The first time you stayed out with a flock alone, the first time you helped birth a lamb, the first time you baked bread that didn't burn. These were your graduations. No certificate, no applause, just a nod maybe, or the quiet satisfaction of being trusted. Aging was a visible thing. You watched it happen in others and then slowly realized it was happening to you. Knees stiffened, eyes blurred, teeth vanished. Life did not promise much, and it delivered less. You didn't expect comfort, only survival. There was no retirement, no golden years. If you were lucky, you slowed down. If you weren't, you kept going until you couldn't. And when that day came, when your body finally said enough, you stopped working, and people called it old age even if you were only 40. Marriage was not about love. Not really. It was about land, about survival, about having someone to split the work with and maybe bear children before the next winter arrived. A husband meant protection. A wife meant meals and mended clothes. Love, if it came, was a luxury. It arrived slowly over shared chores and shared pain, over years of silence and the occasional smile. Weddings were community events, loud, quick, joyful in their own restrained way. Not many decorations, no white dress, just a clean tunic, some bread, maybe a little ale, and dancing in the dirt. Children were expected. Not counted, not always named, but expected. You hoped some would live. Not all did. Childbirth was as much a gamble as anything else. Midwives guided. Women screamed. Men waited. Sometimes everyone survived. Sometimes not. The child might arrive silent. The mother might bleed too long. Death stood close at those moments, closer than the priest, closer than the prayers. But when a child cried and the mother breathed, it felt like a miracle. You baptized the baby quickly. Not out of tradition, but out of fear. You wanted their soul marked just in case. Life had not promised them much more than a hard path, but at least they'd be counted by heaven if not by history. Children worked early. As soon as they could walk, they were tasked with something. Carrying kindling, guarding chickens, shelling peas. Their play was work. Their work was play. There was no line. A doll might be made from rags. A game might involve stacking stones. You didn't tell your child they could be anything. You told them they must be useful. That was the dream, to be useful. Laughter existed, it really did. Not all the time, not every day, but enough. Jokes were crude, sarcastic, biting. Someone falling in the mud was always funny. Someone singing off-key even more so. Gossip passed the time, mocking the steward behind his back, teasing the priest's accent, whispering about a neighbour's strange habits. Festivals were rare but cherished. May Day, Harvest, Saints' Days. Any excuse to stop working even briefly was embraced. You danced around a pole. You drank sour ale. You watched someone dress as a bear and scare the children. These were the high points, the breaks in the monotony. You remembered them like dreams. Illness was frequent. You didn't worry about it, you accepted it. Everyone coughed, everyone limped, everyone had scars. You wrapped a cut in cloth and hoped. You drank herbs and prayed. You didn't go to a hospital, there were none. The wise woman helped if she could. The priest offered last rites if he couldn't. You buried your dead quickly. Cold ground made digging hard. Graves were shallow. Crosses were wood. Names were forgotten, but memories lingered. You remembered how someone laughed, the way they patched their sleeves, the soup they always made with too much garlic, small details that stayed long after the face had faded. Grief was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was a kind of quiet shadow that followed you around the fields. A glance at an empty chair, the way the door creaked and no one came through. You didn't speak of it often, but you felt it always. The village held you, not tightly, not warmly, but firmly. It knew your name. It knew your faults. It knew what kind of bread you baked and what kind of lies you told and who you once kissed behind the grain store. You were not anonymous. You were known, and being known was its own kind of safety. People argued. Of course they did. Over boundaries, over animals, over tools. But most disputes didn't become feuds. They fizzled, they simmered. They were solved with a shrug, a shared ale, a neighbourly nod. You couldn't afford enemies. The village was too small. There were roles, the blacksmith, the thatcher, the midwife, the shepherd. Everyone had a place. Everyone had something they did a little better than others. No one was rich, but no one starved alone either. When someone's roof collapsed, a few neighbours helped. When someone's child cried from hunger, a bit of bread was shared. Not out of charity, but out of understanding. Because next time it might be you. At the heart of your life, whether you acknowledged it or not, was the land. Not just dirt underfoot, but a living presence, constant, demanding, moody. It gave when it felt generous, and it took without apology. The soil shaped your hands, your back, your sleep, your diet, your future. It was your boss, your companion, your battlefield. There were no tractors, no fertilizers, just you, a wooden plough, maybe an ox if your family was fortunate. If not, it was your shoulders, your effort, and a patch of earth that never felt quite fertile enough. Each morning began not with the sunrise, but with an assessment: how damp is the ground? How heavy is the air? Does the wind smell like rain or rot? You didn't farm for abundance. You farmed for survival. Each row of rye was a gamble. Each patch of barley was a prayer. You planted with hope and harvested with resignation. You lost crops to rain, to frost, to rats, to the Lord's demands. You cursed and then planted again. The land didn't care. It never said thank you. A good year was not marked by plenty, but by just enough. Enough grain to fill the sacks, enough straw to patch the roof, enough vegetables to dry or pickle for winter. A truly good year meant your family didn't go hungry in February. A great year, rare and whispered about like a fairy tale, meant there was a little flower left come spring. You didn't own the land. The Lord did. But you knew it better than he ever would. You knew which corner stayed too wet, which plot needed turning twice. You knew where the weeds came early, and where the soil turned to stone a few inches deep. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was lived. Passed from parent to child, kneeling in the same dirt, pointing at the same stubborn row. Fields were not just flat spaces. They were stories. You remembered the harvest when your brother fell sick, the frost that killed the beans just days before St. Martin's, the patch of ground your daughter once danced barefoot across before she had to carry water. Every footstep on your land held memory. You ploughed in long, aching lines. The oxen walked slow. You followed hands, blistered eyes squinting. The sun burned. The rain stung. Sometimes the plough caught on a root and you cursed loud enough to scare the crows. Other times it slid smoothly and you dared to believe the season might be kind. Sowing meant leaning low, dropping seeds one by one, covering them with care and not too much soil. You hoped the birds wouldn't eat them. You hoped they'd sprout. You hoped for things you couldn't control because you had no choice. Harvest was harder. Everyone worked. Children, elders, anyone who could walk. You reaped with sickles sharp, dangerous, often borrowed. Your arms ached after the first hour, but you didn't stop. You couldn't. The crop waited for no one. You bundled sheaves, stacked them, hauled them on your back or in carts if you had wheels. If not, you dragged them inch by inch across uneven ground. Threshing came next, separating the grain from the stalk. Hard labour, rhythmic and loud. Flails struck the earth. Dust rose. You coughed. You sweated. You swore. And when it was done, you stared at the tiny pile and wondered how something so small could demand so much. You stored what you could, in sacks, in jars, in corners of your home where the rats might not reach. You prayed the mould stayed away. You saved some for seed always. No matter how hungry you were, you never ate the last handful, because to eat it was to give up on next year. The land wasn't just for crops. It held the commons, the space where animals grazed, where villagers gathered, where disputes sometimes ended with laughter and sometimes with bruises. You might have a few sheep, a stubborn goat, maybe a cow. They wandered, grazed, left droppings you later shoveled into your garden as fertilizer. Nothing was wasted, not even manure. You cut wood in the forest though you technically weren't supposed to. The Lord owned that too. But rules bent when roofs leaked. You hunted rabbits when you could, though poaching was a crime. You fished in the river quietly without permission. Every fish caught was a small rebellion, a silent no to a system that demanded too much. Sometimes the steward came around. Not the Lord himself, he never came. But his steward did with his ledger and his lists and his expectations. He asked how many sacks you'd harvested, how many eggs your hens laid, how many pigs you'd slaughtered. You lied, of course, carefully. Just enough. Too big a lie meant punishment. Too small meant another hen taken. You owed more than you ever received. Labor grain, eggs, wool. If you had a cow, you owed milk. If you brewed ale, you owed a portion. The system called it fair. You called it surviving. And still the land was yours in a way the manor could never understand. You bled into it. You sweat into it. You buried your kin in it. The fields held more than crops. They held your footsteps, your ancestors, your secrets. The place where your mother whispered to you on your first birthday. The hill where your father watched the storm roll in and said that one's trouble. The tree stump your brother carved his name into before leaving and never returning. Each blade of grass remembered you. Each furrow echoed your motion. The land was indifferent but not unknowing. It didn't love you. It didn't hate you. But it accepted you. And in a world where most systems pushed you down, that was something. You marked time with the land's breath. Planting, growing, harvesting, waiting, it never stopped. Neither did you. And in that constant motion you found meaning. Not comfort, but purpose. You weren't trying to change the world. You were just trying to feed it. One turn of the plough at a time. When winter came, the land slept and so did your tools. But not you. You mended, chopped, watched, worried. You rationed. You planned. You prayed. Spring would come again eventually. It always did. And when it did, you would return to the field, your boots heavy, your hands scarred, your back already aching. Because this was your life, not chosen, not easy, but yours. As spring shook the last frost from its shoulders, you knew what came next. Lambing, sowing, digging, fixing what the winter had broken, and winter always broke something. You stepped outside into a morning still wet with dew, and felt the weight of the coming months settle into your bones. The sky was grey, but not angry, just tired, like you. Seasonal work defined your days. Not in bursts, but in slow stretches. You didn't think in terms of projects, but in cycles. The field that needed turning wasn't a task, it was a season's partner. The fence to mend wasn't a chore, it was a necessary ritual. Nothing was ever done, only delayed, only paused until tomorrow, or the next rain, or until your back gave out. Everyone worked. Children pulled weeds. Women hauled water. Elders mended clothes, watched fires, told stories between coughs. Work was shared often without conversation. You didn't need to ask. You just handed over the tool and the other person knew what came next. Tools were simple. A spade, a rake, a sickle, maybe a hoe if the handle hadn't cracked during the freeze. They were passed down like treasure, repaired with twine, reinforced with iron scraps from some blacksmith 5 villages over. You didn't own many tools, but the ones you had, you knew them like you knew your own hands. Your days moved with the light. You rose when the sky turned pale and worked until it darkened again. Meals came when they could. A piece of bread stuffed into your tunic. A sip of ale passed around like a secret. Sometimes lunch was just the memory of breakfast. You didn't complain. You swallowed. The land asked for everything. So did the manor. So did the seasons. It was hard to tell which was the harshest. The Lord's taxes, the frostbite, or your own hunger, waiting patiently for you to admit defeat. But you didn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because somewhere in the repetition there was meaning. Somewhere in the rhythm there was a strange unspoken comfort. Spring meant new births. Lambs wobbling on legs too thin for the world. Calves blinking into sunlight for the first time. Chicks chirping under makeshift hay shelters. Each one was a small victory. A silent promise that the year might be gentler than the last. You didn't name the animals. That would have made it harder when they had to go. Summer brought more labour, but also moments of stillness. A long pause at midday when the sun stood still overhead, and your sweat soaked through every layer of cloth. You sat under a tree if there was one and chewed on wild mint. You didn't talk much. The heat pressed the words out of you. But sometimes you'd share a quiet joke, a memory, a hum of a song your grandmother used to sing before her voice turned to gravel. When summer storms rolled in, you prayed. Not loudly, just under your breath as you ran to pull in drying herbs to stack firewood under the eaves to make sure the goat hadn't wandered too far again. You knew how fast rain could undo everything. One good hailstorm could flatten your hopes. One flash flood could take the barley like it never even tried to grow. You didn't fight the weather, you learned to read it. The shape of clouds, the weight of the wind, the way birds moved in the air. You listened to the animals, they always knew before you did. And when the storm passed, you counted what remained. Not losses, survivals. Autumn was busy, but in a different way. Less frantic, more solemn. It was the season of gathering, of preparing, of making peace with what you'd accomplished and what you hadn't. You threshed, you dried, you salted, you hung herbs in dark corners, you wrapped garlic in old cloth. Every act was a form of protection, a way of building walls against the cold to come. The harvest was not a celebration, it was a deadline. You couldn't delay it. The frost wouldn't wait. You worked from sunrise to moonrise, hands raw back bent. You filled sacks. You filled cellars. You filled yourself with just enough hope to get through winter again. And winter, winter. It crept in like smoke. You never saw the day it arrived. You only noticed the days shortening the air, sharpening the sheep huddling closer together. You moved slower. You spoke less. Everything was harder, carrying water, starting fires, waking up. Inside the hearth was your sun. You built your days around it. Meals were cooked slowly, if at all. You mended tools, you mended clothes, you mended stories, retelling them until they fit the mood, the weather, the silence. Nights were long. Sleep came in fits. Dreams wandered further than your feet ever could. You counted wood. You counted sacks of grain. You counted days until St. Bridget, until the snow started to melt, until the sun felt warm again. Winter was survival, not just from the cold, but from the stillness, from the dark thoughts that bloomed like mould in corners of the room where no one swept. But even then, even in the deep midwinter, there were sparks of light. A neighbour knocking to share stew. A baby born in the night. A story retold in such a way that it made someone laugh. Laughter in winter was sacred, a kind of defiance, a refusal to let the dark win. Feast days broke the rhythm, gave shape to the year. The church dictated them. Saint days, Candlemas, Mid-Lent. Each one came with rituals, with expectations, with just enough food to remind you of colour and warmth. Maybe a pie, maybe a cup of cider, maybe a song louder than usual. You lived for those days, not for the food, but for the memory of being something more than tired. The seasons turned whether you were ready or not. You couldn't control them. You couldn't predict them, but you could endure them. You could build your life into their rhythms like a vine twisting around a post. You could survive not in the grand, noble way of stories, but in the quiet, everyday way that stories forget to mention. And in that survival there was power. Not loud, not obvious, but steady, relentless, real. You didn't think of yourself as a builder, but every year you built. Not just fences and sheds and chicken coops held together with more prayer than nails. You built a life out of seasons. You built a shelter from habits. And you built meaning from repetition. There was no blueprint, no great plan. Just what had always been done. What you'd seen your parents do. What they had seen before them. Each spring you checked the roof. It always sagged, always leaked, always begged for more straw. You fixed it with what you had last year's thatch. New bundles from the field, your own aching arms. You replaced the broken beams with logs stripped of bark. None were straight, none were perfect, but they held. When a door cracked or swelled in the rain, you planed it until it fit again badly perhaps, but enough to latch. You stuffed rags in gaps. You tied the window shutters shut with bits of frayed rope. You repaired the cottage wall with more daub, mud, straw and hope. It was never enough. But it never needed to be perfect. It just needed to last until next winter. Repairs weren't about pride, they were about continuity. You didn't show off what you'd fixed. You didn't even speak of it. You just noticed quietly that the wind didn't bite quite as hard by the hearth, that the bucket didn't catch as much rain, that the baby didn't shiver as much when the snow fell sideways. Every household in the village looked the same, squat, sagging, patchworked with years. The outsides wore the seasons like skin mud streaked from a wet spring, a dusting of soot from summer cooking icicles hanging from the same bent eaves in winter. You could walk through the village with your eyes closed and still know whose cottage you passed just by the way the door creaked or the chickens clucked. Inside, nothing was ornamental. A table with legs carved by someone who knew just enough to keep it from collapsing. A stool with one leg shorter than the rest. A bench that wobbled if you sat too far to one side. But they were yours, or close enough. They'd been carried through births and deaths, through winters and weddings. That gave them value. The hearth was central. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. It was where meals were made, warmth was gathered, stories were told, and the day's silence was unwrapped and shared. Fire was life. You kept it going even when the wood was damp, even when the wind sucked the heat straight up through the roof. Coals were banked every night, wrapped in ash to coax them into morning. You didn't have a chimney, just a hole in the roof. The smoke curled through the rafters, staining everything it touched. Walls, ceilings, skin. The air was thick but familiar. You didn't cough because of it anymore. You coughed because that's just what you did. Cooking was a ritual of resourcefulness. Every scrap mattered. You saved bacon grease in a cracked jug. You saved bones for broth. You saved the water you washed herbs in just in case. The stew was never the same, yet always the same. A mix of what was left over and what could still be found. Some called it pottage. Others just called it dinner. A good stew simmered for days. You added to it when you had something new. You stirred it with the same wooden spoon used by your mother, her mother, and maybe someone else before them. You scraped the bottom to catch the best bits thicker, saltier, somehow more real. Bread was baked when there was flour, dense dark made of whatever grains you had. Rye, oats, barley, never wheat. That was for the Lord or the church or people with last names. Your loaves didn't rise, they just endured. Like you. On feast days you brought out your best, a little cheese, maybe a preserved apple, maybe honey, if the bees had been generous and you hadn't needed to burn the hives to keep warm. You didn't feast for the sake of it. You feasted to remind yourself that joy was still possible, that flavour still had a place however brief. The animals were not pets, they were housemates, Chickens nested under the bench. A goat might sleep by the wall. The cow stayed outside unless the weather argued otherwise. You didn't mind. They were warm. They were noisy. They smelled. But they were alive, and that was more than some neighbours could say in bad years. The children played with sticks, with stones, with the same toys every generation of peasant children had used. Dolls made from corn husks, tiny carts carved from firewood scraps. They didn't need much. They learned early what was pretend and what was necessary. They carried water. They mended clothes. They grew into the roles waiting for them before they had a say in it. In the evenings you sat, sometimes on the bench, sometimes on the floor. You rubbed your hands, stretched your back, looked at the fire and said nothing. Not every day needed words. Silence wasn't emptiness, it was rest. It was the only luxury you could afford, and even then only in small doses. When someone visited, you poured them ale, even if you had barely enough for your own. Hospitality wasn't a virtue, it was a currency. You helped others because one day you'd need them to help you. It was an economy of favours, a system of unspoken debts and quiet returns. You gossiped, not cruelly, just enough to stay connected. You knew who was courting who was expecting, who lost another chicken to a fox, who had the best onions this year. It kept you human. It kept the winter from swallowing you whole. On feast days or weddings you sang, not well, not with harmony, but with heart. You stomped your feet on the packed earth floor. You clapped. You laughed like someone who'd seen hunger and survived. Like someone who didn't care how crooked the table was so long as there was bread on it. And when death came, and it always did, you mourned with the same tools you used to live. Shared food, shared fire, shared silence. The body was laid near the hearth. The priest was called if he could come. If not, the neighbours gathered murmured prayers and wrapped the dead in linen saved for that purpose. There was no grandeur, no eulogies, just the deep recognition that another pair of hands would no longer share in the work, another voice would no longer join in the evening song, and then you carried on. Because the fence still needed mending, the pot still needed stirring, life still needed living. That was how you built, not with stone or stained glass, but with consistency, with care, with the quiet conviction that a patched roof, a warm hearth and a neighbour's nod could be enough. That if you did your part, whatever small, fragile part that was, you had built something. Not great, not lasting, but real. And in that quiet reality you found something the nobles never could. A peace built not from leisure but from effort. A pride stitched not into banners but into blankets. A life humble and half-broken but yours. You had no word for mental health. You barely had words for your own feelings. But you knew what it meant to be tired in a way that didn't come from the body. To wake up heavy. To feel a greyness that no fire could chase away. You wouldn't call it depression. You'd just call it having a hard season. Or too many bad winters. Or nothing at all. You just lived with it. Because you had to. There was no healer for the mind, no confessional where you said, I'm struggling. If you brought a concern to the priest, it had to be wrapped in sin. I haven't prayed enough. I've been envious. I've lost hope. And then he would tell you to fast, or to walk to a shrine, or to pray harder. You nodded. You tried. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it didn't. You didn't expect joy. That was a feeling for feast days, for weddings, for the brief moment when a newborn's cry rang through the cottage and the midwife smiled. But in between you didn't aim for joy. You aimed for okay. You aimed for no one's sick today and the stew hasn't burned and the roof held. That was enough. You were not alone in this. Everyone you knew carried something. A grief for a sibling buried too young. A fear that this year would be like the last. A weariness that didn't leave no matter how long you slept, But you didn't name it. You didn't diagnose it. You just kept going. Routine was your salve. Wake, feed the fire, milk the goat, stir the pot, mend the fence, sit by the hearth, sleep, again and again. The rhythm dulled the sharper thoughts. It gave the days shape, and shape gave you something to hold on to. When you needed to talk, you didn't announce it. You didn't ask, "Do you have time?" You just stood beside someone in the field, shoulder to shoulder, and let the silence hold both of you until words trickled out. Maybe about the barley, maybe about the weather, maybe if the moment was right about something deeper, but only if it could be folded into the task at hand. You didn't cry often, not because you didn't feel, but because there was rarely space for it. Tears came at funerals, at births, sometimes in the dead of night muffled by straw, but they came privately because you couldn't afford to be undone. Not for long. The goat still needed feeding, and yet your life was not without softness. You found it in the way your neighbour left onions on your doorstep when your child had a fever, in the way your grandmother hummed the same tune every time she stirred the pot, in the way the village cat chose your lap just once and then never again. Affection was practical. A wool cloak passed down, a hand on the shoulder after a funeral, bread shared before anyone else ate, no poetry, no confessions, just care expressed in actions because words cost too much. Humour survived too. Quiet, biting, often whispered. You made jokes about the steward's wig, the priest's breath, the Lord's soft hands. You laughed when the goat escaped again, when the pig followed you home, when your child smeared mud across your last clean tunic and called it fixing it. The laughter wasn't joy, it was resistance, a way of saying you didn't break me yet. There were dreams, not grand ones. You didn't dream of castles, you dreamed of more eggs, a softer bed, a winter where no one coughed. You dreamed of your children growing tall, of your back not hurting, of a summer where everything you planted grew. These dreams weren't wild, but they were enough to keep you moving. Sometimes you envied the birds, not for their flight, but for their detachment. They didn't worry about tithes or taxes or which herb might cure a cough. They simply were. And yet when one nested above your door, you smiled, took it as a blessing, a sign that even something as free as a bird saw safety in your roof. You did what you could to care for others. You held your neighbour's child when she laboured. You took soup to the man who lost his wife. You repaired the fence when the old man couldn't lift the hammer. Not because you were saintly, but because you hoped someone would do the same for you. Religion gave you structure, but not always comfort. Some Sundays the Mass lifted you. On others the words felt heavy, the incense too thick, the promises too far away. You said the prayers anyway. You lit the candles. You hoped it counted for something. When a festival came, you embraced it with a fervour that bordered on desperation. You danced badly. You drank too much. You sang too loud. Because you needed the reminder that life was more than dirt and debt. That there was still colour in the world, still music, still breath. Art existed, but not on your walls. It was carved into spoons, etched into the handle of a rake, woven into the patterns on a wool shawl. Every scratch of decoration said, "I am more than just a worker." You stitched meaning into utility. There were games, simple ones, a circle drawn in dirt, stones tossed just right, children chasing each other in crooked lines. You watched them with a strange ache, because they hadn't learned yet that the world wasn't fair, that some winters would always take more than others. But you didn't rush to tell them, you let them believe. When stories were told, they weren't about glory, they were about survival. The year the snow came early and didn't leave, the time the cow gave twins, the summer when the river flooded and no one died. These stories were lessons disguised as memories. You told them by firelight, watching your child's eyes widen, not with fear, but with belonging. You aged faster than your years. Your hands cracked before 30. Your teeth loosened. Your knees protested every morning. But you didn't mark age by numbers. You marked it by milestones: the first time your child carried water, the last time you could carry 2 buckets without stopping. Even in decline you mattered. The village didn't discard you. You became a keeper of knowledge, of weather patterns, of how to bind a wound, of where the best mushrooms grew. You became a reference point, a memory that still breathed. Love existed too, not always romantic, often quiet. A glance, a shared chore, a hand grasped in the dark. You didn't speak of it often, but it was there, braided into your days, as inseparable from your life as the sky. When you died, the world didn't pause. The pot still boiled, the goat still bleated, but you were remembered, not with statues or songs, but with habits. A recipe you passed down, a patch on the roof you once fixed, a story that began, "She always said," and in this way you lingered, not as a name in a book, but as a presence in the hands of your children, in the tools they used, in the way they faced the morning. You were not forgotten. You were folded into the earth and into them, and they would carry you forward without knowing they did. You lived on borrowed time and borrowed land, and as the years passed you began to notice the seasons less by the colour of the leaves and more by what ached when you woke up. Your knees in November, your back in April. You marked time in blisters and calluses, in the way the wind howled differently between summer and winter. Each new year wasn't greeted with celebration, but with the quiet tally of things that had broken, and things that still worked. Still, you weren't without knowledge. You had more than you were ever given credit for. You could read the clouds like scripture knew when a frost would come by how the chickens huddled, and could tell the difference between a good silence and the kind that meant a fox was nearby. You didn't go to school, but you'd memorize the growing cycle of every plant in your garden, the proper depth to bury the seeds, the right rhythm to turn the soil. Your fingers were your notebooks, your life, your textbook. You knew the medicines that worked because you had to. Which leaves calmed a fever, which roots made the bowels move, which mushrooms killed. The last you learned from whispers after someone didn't come home from the woods. The world didn't give you mercy, but it gave you clues. You just had to learn them faster than they could kill you. Your calendar wasn't made of paper. It was a wheel of tasks: planting, weeding, harvesting, preserving. It spun endlessly, and if you missed your place on it, everything else fell apart. You had to know when to trap rabbits, when to dry herbs, when to collect eggs before the sun made them spoil. Your year was a series of crucial guesses sharpened by generations of trying. You could fix things. Not well, maybe, but well enough. A fence patched with twine, a boot stuffed with wool, a spoon carved from a piece of driftwood. You didn't have the luxury of waste. If something broke, you worked around it. If something tore, you mended it, even if it meant your clothes looked like patchwork maps. There was no shame in that. Each stitch was a refusal to give up. The cold wasn't just a season, it was a test. When winter came, it came hungry. You had to plan months ahead. Firewood stacked high, salted meat if you were lucky, root vegetables buried in straw. And yet, despite all your preparation, there was always a week, sometimes more, when the food got tight, when the nights felt longer than the days, when the breath of your loved ones was the only proof that you weren't alone in the dark. Fire was life. You guarded it like treasure, not just for warmth or cooking, but for light. When the sun went down, it was your only defense against the night. You learned to start it in the rain, to bank the coals so they'd last till morning, to blow gently across kindling until it caught. A fire kept the house alive even when the people in it felt like ghosts. Sometimes you sang, not to perform but to endure, while you weeded, while you scrubbed, while you walked. Your voice wasn't pretty, but it was steady. The songs had been passed down word for word, sometimes nonsense, sometimes prayer, sometimes both. You didn't sing to be heard, you sang to remember, to remind yourself that you were part of something older than pain. You didn't think of yourself as poor. That word didn't mean anything. You had what you had. You made do. It was the making do that defined you. It was the way you wrapped your feet in cloth when your shoes gave out. The way you learned to count without numbers, measure without scales, navigate without maps. That was richness in its own way. You didn't envy the nobility, not really. Their lives were alien. You heard about their feasts and their velvet robes, their falcons and their foreign spices, but you couldn't picture it. It was like imagining the moon made of cheese. You were more likely to envy the neighbour whose roof didn't leak, whose chickens laid twice a day, whose child hadn't yet coughed blood. That was the kind of wealth you could understand. The idea of fairness never came up. It wasn't a word you used. You knew the world wasn't fair. You saw it every time the steward smiled while taking your last sack of grain, every time the priest demanded offerings with one hand and offered comfort with the other. But you didn't dwell on it, not because it didn't matter, but because fairness was a luxury for people with enough time to imagine things being different. You remembered everyone, the names of every person who ever helped you, the times they came through for you, the times you came through for them. Debts weren't written down, they are carried in your chest. You repaid them quietly over years in favours and food and unspoken promises. That was your economy. Children were your future and your burden. You loved them. You also feared for them. You taught them what you knew as soon as they could hold a tool. You hoped they'd grow strong. You prayed they wouldn't get sick. You told them stories not to entertain but to prepare. Every bedtime tale was a warning wrapped in wonder. Every lullaby had sharp edges. There were times when everything went wrong. The rain came early. The roof caved in. A cow miscarried. A neighbour died. And in those times, you didn't fall apart. You bent. You gathered. You did what needed doing. You didn't call it resilience. You just called it another day. You held funerals without flowers. You marked graves with stones. You spoke the names of the dead only when it was safe to do so, when the fire was low and the children were asleep. You didn't believe in forgetting, but you understood that remembering too often could break a person. Your life was shaped by limits, but within those limits you carved space. You planted herbs that no one asked for. You carved patterns into your tools. You taught your child a song you wrote. You smiled at the way the wind caught the edge of a scarf and made it dance. You found beauty not in abundance but in detail. You didn't hope for heaven as a reward. You hoped for it as a rest. A place where your knees wouldn't hurt and your back would hold. Where you wouldn't be cold. Where no one would take your food. You didn't need golden streets. You just needed a bed that didn't creak and a stew that didn't run thin. There was no retirement, only slowing down. You did less each year, but you did it more slowly, more carefully. You passed your duties to your children like a relay. You taught them how to do things the right way, or at least the way that had worked for you. You hoped they listened. And in the end, when your body gave out, you hoped to be remembered not for what you accomplished, because there were no monuments, but for what you endured, for how many winters you survived, for how many people you fed, for the kindness you gave away even when you were tired. That was legacy. That was enough. The deeper into your bones the years settled, the more you came to rely not on the strength of your body, but on the rhythm of what you knew. You could hear the weather in your joints. You could sense bad news in the way birds went quiet. You didn't rush anymore, but you didn't need to. Every movement had become deliberate, every action informed by decades of doing it wrong first, then getting it right just enough to keep going. You remembered things that others forgot. The year the rye grew black with mould. The spring when the snow stayed too long. The autumn when the acorns were so plentiful the pigs got fat early. These weren't just memories, they were tools. You passed them down in stories not because you wanted to be wise, but because forgetting them might mean someone else didn't make it. You became the one people asked. How deep should I bury this? Is that a sick chicken or just an old one? Will the frost hold till morning? You didn't always have answers, but you always had perspective. That was your gift. Not certainty, just the patience to wait and see. You didn't measure your worth in possessions because you didn't have many. You measured it in what you had kept alive. A patched roof, a loyal dog, a child with strong arms and quiet eyes, a garden that still bloomed even after the hardest winter. These were your trophies. These were your triumphs. Some nights when the fire burned low and everyone else had gone to sleep, you stared into the embers and remembered names. People who had vanished. People who had suffered. People who had laughed beside you once. You didn't speak their names aloud, not always, but you carried them. You kept them real by surviving them, and maybe, just maybe, someone would carry your name the same way. You had lived through plagues that stole breath, famines that made silence taste like ash, winters that shrank the world to the edge of the hearth, summers so dry the soil cracked like old skin. You knew how to wait things out, not optimistically but stubbornly, with clenched teeth and rough prayers and endless small repairs. Your body failed before your mind did, but even your thoughts slowed like snow settling in a field. You stopped caring about what was fashionable in the manor house. You stopped wondering what life might have been if you'd been born somewhere else. That kind of dreaming belonged to the young. You were done with what if. You were here, and that was enough. The stew kept cooking, the animals kept waking, the seasons kept spinning, and in that there was peace. You had known love, though it looked different from the songs. It looked like someone covering your feet when you slept, like a shared crust of bread on the worst day of the year, like a silent look across a table that said, "I'm still here," without needing to say anything at all. You didn't need poetry. You had partnership. You had known loss too. Quiet, relentless, and unglamorous. The kind of loss that doesn't stop the world, just shifts it slightly out of place. A sibling who didn't wake. A friend who vanished into the woods one day and never came back. A child who coughed too hard for too long. And you kept going, not because it didn't hurt, but because stopping wouldn't bring them back. The priest said heaven was for the obedient. You weren't sure you had been obedient. You had been tired. You had been hungry. You had been angry. But you had also been kind. You had shared when you could. You had forgiven more than you were thanked for. You hoped that counted. You had become invisible in a way. Not unseen people still came to you for advice, for stories, for old songs that only you remembered. But invisible in the sense that no one expected you to change anymore. You had become part of the landscape, like the leaning fence post or the elm tree that bloomed late. And that was strangely freeing. The younger ones called you wise. You weren't. You just remembered when things were worse, and you knew better than to believe that bad times meant the end. Bad times were just part of the cycle. What mattered was what you did with the good times in between. You stopped asking for more. You asked for enough. A dry night, a warm fire, a bowl with something in it, a roof that stayed still in the wind. That was your abundance. That was your luxury. You watched the next generation repeat your steps, sometimes stubbornly, sometimes eagerly, often imperfectly. You didn't correct them unless it mattered. You let them fail sometimes. That's how you'd learned. You just made sure they didn't fail in a way they couldn't come back from. The world had changed. A little. The Lord had a new steward. The priest had learned some new Latin words. A traveller once said there was a war happening far away, or a new tax, or a new king. You listened, nodded, and went back to your chores. The soil didn't care about politics, and neither did your sheep. You began to find joy in the smallest things. The first sprout after winter. The exact moment a loaf cracked open in the oven. A bird you hadn't seen since you were a child. The sound of laughter that wasn't forced. A sunset that made even the smoke look like gold. When you could no longer rise easily in the morning, others helped. Not because they were told to, because they had seen you do the same. The care you had given came back to you slow, but sure, like water finding its level. Your body shrank. Your world narrowed. You saw fewer people, walked less distance, spoke less often. But what you said mattered more, because it came from experience, because it came from knowing that words are like seeds, they grow even when you're gone. And when your time came, when the aches became more constant than your breath, when the fire didn't warm you, the same way anymore you weren't afraid. Not really. You'd seen too much to be afraid. You had buried too many good people to believe death was punishment. You saw it as a kind of return, not a reward, just a rest. You hoped someone would remember your name, or at least the way you stirred the pot with your left hand, or how you always knew which herbs to hang in the window, or how you told the story about the ghost in the forest with the voice of a rooster. You didn't need a monument. You had been part of the rhythm. You had been part of the story. You had been someone's elder, someone's helper, someone's favourite. And in that final quiet, as your eyes closed and the world narrowed to the glow of the fire and the smell of bread, and the murmur of those you loved around you, you let go. Not in fear, in peace. If your body was the story, your hands were the chapters. Every callus, every scar, every slow ache under the surface was a record of where you had been, what you had done, and how many winters you'd worked through. These hands, thick-fingered, always slightly cracked, sometimes trembling, had built, fed, defended, and mourned. They had planted seeds you never saw bloom and buried things you loved. They were your proof of life. Each morning, even now, you still moved them carefully, slowly checking what they could still do. Could they lift a pot? Could they braid twine? Could they warm themselves by the fire? Some days, yes. Some days, not quite. But they always remembered how. The younger ones didn't notice it yet, but they would. How the stiffness crept in like fog. How the strength left gradually, not in a dramatic collapse, but in tiny hesitations. A pail of water feeling heavier than it used to, a knife resisting where it used to glide. That was age, and age wasn't something you fought. It was something you respected, like fire, like frost. You moved less now, you watched more, but watching was its own kind of work. You saw when a tool was being used wrong, when a sheep limped slightly, when a child was angry but pretending not to be. Observation was a skill, and you had earned it. In the evenings when the work was done, or at least paused, you sometimes told stories. Not because you fancied yourself a storyteller, but because people asked, and because you remembered. You remembered the long famine, and how one old woman kept everyone from starving by showing them how to turn tree bark into bread. You remembered the year the river froze so hard a deer walked across it and then fell through. You remembered the laughter of a man who had lost everything but still sang as if he hadn't noticed. Your stories weren't fables. They didn't always have morals. They were memory with the edges frayed. They are instructions, comforts, reminders that hard things had been survived before and would be survived again. They didn't always get told the same way. Sometimes you added a joke, sometimes you left out the ending, That was your right. You had lived them. Some stories you never told. They were too soft, too close. Like the first time someone said your name with affection, or the last time you held a child who didn't make it through the winter. Those stories stayed inside you, heavy and tender, kept like embers for warmth. When you walked now, it was with a stick, not because you were weak, but because you were wise. The stick wasn't a symbol of decline, it was a symbol of adaptation. It helped you stay upright. It helped you keep walking, and walk you did still slowly. To the well, to the bench by the door, to the edge of the garden where the mint grew, where the bees still wandered lazily from leaf to leaf, as if they too were starting to forget urgency. You didn't expect comfort. You didn't resent its absence. But when it came a warm day, a quiet moment, a familiar face, you received it fully. You let it soak into your bones like sun into a cracked window pane. People brought you things now. Bits of bread. News from the next village. A flower plucked just because it was blue. You thanked them quietly, sometimes with a nod, sometimes with a word, and always with your eyes. Gratitude didn't need volume. Your world had shrunk, but it hadn't dimmed. It had become more concentrated. Every object had meaning. Every task had weight. Every kindness had depth. The cot where you slept wasn't comfortable, but it was yours. It creaked when you rolled over. It welcomed the shape of your tired back. The blanket, patched and uneven, smelled of smoke and lavender. It had been made by someone who still thought of you. Sometimes in the middle of the night you would wake not from discomfort but from memory. A sound from long ago. A laugh. A word. A scent. It would float through your thoughts like a feather through a shaft of light. You wouldn't try to catch it. You'd just let it pass. You didn't fear the dark anymore. It had walked beside you for too long to be a stranger. You knew its tricks, you knew its silences, and you knew it always gave way to light eventually. Your role in the village had changed. Once you were a builder, then a grower, then a teacher. Now you were a witness, a keeper of patterns, a holder of stories. People asked you questions not because you knew everything, but because you knew what had come before. And that made your answers feel like anchors. You weren't alone, even if you spent hours without speaking, even if you sometimes went to bed before the fire burned out. You could still hear life, children arguing in the lane, a hen squawking indignantly, someone chopping wood too hastily. These were your lullabies now. And when something went wrong, when a cow gave birth too early, or the stew curdled, or the firewood got wet, they still came to you. Not for miracles, for grounding. For the look in your eyes that said, yes, this has happened before. Yes, you'll get through it. Some days your joints ached too much to stand. So you sat by the door and the village passed by you like a quiet parade. People waved. Some stopped to talk, some just nodded. You nodded back, and when children played too close and knocked over your basket, you didn't scold. You smiled. You let them help pick things up. You told them a quick story while you did, because even accidents were opportunities. You never said back in my day because you knew their day would be just as hard in its own way. You offered help, not judgment. Perspective, not comparison. You still had small rituals, a bit of bread by the window for the birds, a whispered prayer before each meal, the careful folding of your tunic at night even if no one else would see. These weren't habits, they were acts of meaning. They kept your shape intact. There were days, fewer now, when you walked to the field just to feel the soil under your feet. You didn't work it anymore, but you touched it. And it knew you. It remembered your weight, your steps, your rhythm. You had once dreamed of travelling, of seeing cities, of hearing music that didn't come from wind or water. Those dreams hadn't come true, but they hadn't betrayed you either. They had kept you company, and in a way, you had travelled, across decades, through seasons, through every face that changed around you while yours remained softened and deepened by time. You'd been angry once. You'd wanted things to be fairer, kinder. You still did. But now you understood that fairness wasn't something the world owed. It was something people created in tiny ways, sharing a loaf, mending a fence, holding someone's hand without needing a reason. You would leave behind no grand legacy, no portrait, no statue, but you would leave behind the habits of care. The tools passed down, the seeds saved in a jar, the song sung softly while stirring the pot. That was enough. The medieval calendar wasn't marked by vacations or leisure. There were no holidays just for fun, no weekends to anticipate. Time moved by necessity, by rhythm, by survival. Days blurred into one another unless they were feast days or fast days, or unless something extraordinary interrupted the quiet repetition. And most of the time, nothing did. Yet within this repetition there was structure, sacred, seasonal, and somehow soothing. You always knew what needed doing next. It was written in the frost on the windows, in the call of the birds returning from the edge of winter, in the way the sun hit the barn door just a little earlier than yesterday. Life was predictable in the smallest ways. You marked your year by patterns, lambing, season planting, season harvest, culling, mending, turning soil again. Every task returned. Every hardship circled back, but so did every small joy. The first green shoot in a dry spring. The smell of bread that didn't come from desperation but from celebration. The warm thrum of wool newly carded. There were other patterns too, personal ones. You rose with the light and sat by the hearth as the dusk returned. You checked the thatch for leaks before every storm. You counted eggs without thinking. You knew how many logs you'd need before the next frost. Your hands knew every splinter of the broom handle without needing to look. The bells from the chapel in the next village, if the wind was right, rang out across the hills to mark certain hours. Matins, Lord's Vespers. You didn't understand all the names, but the sounds broke the silence, and the silence welcomed them. Even if the words were foreign, their rhythm was familiar. In the evenings you sometimes gathered with others, not for parties, not for entertainment, but for the kind of quiet fellowship that required no agenda. You shared time like you shared bread, slowly with care and without the need to finish quickly. There might be singing low and simple, no instruments, just voices layered like threads. The songs weren't written down. They passed from one mouth to another like warm breath in cold air. A lullaby about rain, a chant for mending, a harvest refrain whose meaning had faded but whose melody lingered like honey in old wood. Children played in the dust, their games mimicking the chores they saw pretend milking, make-believe ploughing imaginary stew stirred with twigs. It wasn't innocent play so much as practice. Preparation for a life they were already beginning to shoulder. You watched them sometimes and remembered your own childhood, which hadn't felt like a distinct phase, but more like a narrower version of adulthood. You'd been asked to carry, to feed animals, to scrub. No one waited for you to be ready. You just became useful. And when the days grew short and the cold slipped into every gap in the doorframe, you returned to your oldest rituals, sealing windows with cloth banking. The fire checking the grain stores again and again, as if numbers might change with enough staring. They didn't. Winter was cruel and slow. It wasn't dramatic like stories said. There were no monstrous blizzards sweeping peasants off their feet. Just persistent damp, cold that made your bones feel like they'd forgotten how to be solid, wind that blew through every mistake you'd made in building the house, snow that came quietly like a judgment. But winter was also still, and in stillness there was space for reflection, for repetition, for storytelling. You repeated the same story 3 nights in a row and no one minded, no one interrupted, because the story wasn't just about plot, it was about rhythm, familiarity, warmth in words. This was where traditions lived, not in ceremonies or rules, but in habits so old they felt like instinct. The way you held your cup with both hands when it was hot, the way you sprinkled flour in a cross before kneading, the way the children knew not to step on the cracks in the stone outside the church door. They didn't know why, they just didn't. And though you were poor by any measure, certainly by the standards of lords or travellers, you never truly saw yourself as destitute. You had food sometimes, you had warmth sometimes, you had people most times. You knew their moods by their footsteps, their grief by the silence behind their eyes, their joy by the slight lift in their shoulders. These were your riches, not counted, not weighed, not measured in coin or cloth or cattle, but present, lived, real. Occasionally someone would say something wistful. Maybe the next village has better bread, or I wonder what the city smells like. But no one ever left the next morning. The fantasy lived best untested. It offered comfort not in its possibility but in its permanence. The dream was a guest that stayed quietly in the corner, never needing to be fed. You didn't envy the lord. You didn't envy the priest. You didn't envy the merchant who passed through twice a year with his wagon full of fabrics and dried figs and stories about wars you didn't understand. Their lives were too fast, too full. Yours was narrow but deep. A well, not a river. And depth had its own rewards. You knew the taste of every herb in your garden by scent alone. You could hear the difference between the cry of a hungry child and one who just wanted to be held. You knew how to mend the fence with 3 knots and 2 nails, not 4. You could find your way home in darkness, with only the crunch of the path to guide you. This knowing, this embodied, repeated, wordless knowing, was your education. It wasn't prized by those in power. It wasn't written about. But it was real. It shaped your days. It shaped your identity. You weren't just a peasant. You were a keeper of ways, a carrier of patterns, a master of making do, a guardian of warmth in a cold, indifferent world. The historians wouldn't write about you. They'd write about the wars, the kings, the famines, the great cathedrals. But you were the reason those things could exist. You baked the bread the monks ate. You raised the oxen that ploughed the fields that fed the armies. You patched the roofs under which the future was born. You didn't need a name in the records. You had your name in the breath of your children, in the feel of the soil between your fingers, in the shadow your hut cast at sundown. And at night, as the fire died low and the wind pressed against the shutter, you whispered a simple prayer, not for wealth, not for glory, but for another morning, another warm bowl, another moment to pass on what mattered. At first the storm doesn't announce itself. There's no thunderclap or lightning bolt, just a change in the air, thicker, heavier, as if the sky has decided to lean closer to the ground. The chickens quiet. The goats press themselves closer to the walls. You know what's coming. Everyone does. You've seen it before. The sky goes from grey to steel. The wind starts to hum low through the thatch. You pull your cloak tighter and your feet begin moving before your thoughts catch up. You have done this before. You secure the shutters. You check the roof beams. You call the children inside. You press the last logs into the hearth and bank them deep. Outside, the clouds fold over themselves like wool being wrung out. The sun vanishes completely, not hidden, but gone as though it never existed. When the rain begins, it doesn't fall. It lashes, it punches, it flattens the soil and turns every path into soup. You listen as the storm hits your home. Every drop becomes a drumbeat. Every gust of wind a question: will the roof hold? Will the back wall finally collapse? Is that creaking just old wood or something worse? You sit surrounded by family, by damp straw, by stew that's been reheated so many times it now tastes like nothing. You try to tell a story, but no one listens. Everyone is waiting, even the fire. The children stare at the door wide-eyed, expecting it to open on its own. When lightning strikes, it splits the sky like a bone snapping, and for a moment the whole village blinks silver. You catch sight of the sheep still huddled under the lean-to. You hope it doesn't collapse. You hope they make it. Storms in the medieval world weren't background noise. They were events. Sometimes they washed out roads. Sometimes they drowned fields. Sometimes they pulled trees from the ground and dropped them across roofs or people. Sometimes they brought hail, hard, fist-sized ice that shattered windows, killed animals and turned gardens to pulp. You've seen it happen. You've helped bury the dead. So you wait. You wait for the rain to stop, for the wind to shift, for the calm to return, or for the damage to reveal itself. And when it does, as it always does, you go outside, slowly, carefully. The air smells like mud and pine sap. The world looks bruised. The road has vanished under a thick blanket of brown water. A fence is gone. You find a hen drenched and shivering hiding behind the woodpile. She lets you pick her up. You tuck her into your coat. You whisper something you don't even understand. Maybe she does. Neighbours begin to emerge. No one speaks right away. You glance at each other, make eye contact, and then look past toward roofs, toward animals, toward the patches of earth where you planted onions a month ago. Your stomach clenches. It's not fear, it's calculation. The cost of the storm is still unfolding. You walk the perimeter of your home. There's a leak in the corner near the fire. You patch it with cloth. One of the goats has wandered off. You call for it until your voice goes hoarse. A tree has fallen across the well path. You'll need help moving it, but you're not alone. That's the secret of this place, this rough, muddy, often bitter place. You endure together. A boy from down the lane helps you clear branches. You send your daughter to check on old Marjorie. She returns wide-eyed with the news that her roof has caved in. Half the village goes to help. The other half brings stew. It's thin. It's enough. In this, life storms don't destroy you all at once. They test you in pieces, in a cracked beam, in a flooded patch of barley, in a damp mattress and a child's shivering fever the next morning. And you fight back, not with rage or magic or pride, but with buckets, with shared labour, with knowing where the dry rushes are hidden. You know what to do. You've been doing it all your life. Later, when the rain has stopped completely, and the sun struggles through the haze, you take a walk. The village is quiet, damp, still. You walk past the chapel, past the elder's house, past the field where the scarecrow now lies face down in the mud. You lift him, prop him back up, straighten his hat. He's no good like this, but he's tradition. Back inside, you sit near the hearth again. The heat is weaker than before, but still there. You lean back and let yourself breathe. The roof held, mostly. The fence can be repaired. The goat will probably come back. This too is a pattern. Storms will come. They always do. Some take more than others. Some feel like they might be the last, but none have been yet. That's not hope. That's memory. The knowledge that you've survived before. That you're still here. That tomorrow somehow the stew will bubble again. As night falls, the quiet returns. Not the empty kind, the earned kind. The one that wraps around you like a dry blanket smelling of smoke and sweat, and something you can't name. Maybe it's dignity. Maybe it's stubbornness. Maybe it's simply the knowledge that you did what needed to be done again. And when the children fall asleep, one curled against your leg, the other clutching a wooden spoon like a sword, you allow yourself to close your eyes. The wind might rise again tomorrow, the clouds might return, but tonight you've earned this sleep. And even as the rain taps faintly against the shutter, you dream not of palaces or feasts, but of roofs that hold goats, that return fences that stay upright. Because in a world ruled by nature, nobility, and God, sometimes survival is the most heroic act of all. Even before your eyelids peel open, the day is already speaking to you, not in words, but in weight. The way your spine feels tighter than usual, the way your fingers curl stiff from sleep. It's not a special day, not a saint's feast, not the arrival of some rare visitor. Just another stretch of daylight you'll have to get through. Someone in the room is already awake. They always are. The oldest or the most anxious, or the one who couldn't fall back asleep after the dog barked at some imagined thing in the dark. You hear the sound of the fire being stirred, wood scraping stone embers, exhaling life again. You sit up slowly, careful not to jostle the child at your side. Your legs complain as they bend. Your toes sink into dirt packed so firm it might as well be stone. Another day begins. The same routine repeated like a prayer. Start with the coals. You crouch by the hearth and coax a flame from the grey, letting it catch on twigs, then branches. It's slow. Everything is slow here. You don't rush heat. Outside, the world is damp with last night's chill. The sky is dull, just beginning to shift from slate to something warmer. You step out with a small bucket to gather the morning's work eggs if the hens have laid. You lift one bird gently. Nothing. The next gives you a surprise. You pocket the warm shell with care, as if it might break from a single thought. The goat greets you with a bleat that sounds like a complaint. You tie her, gently murmur nonsense, and begin milking. The sound is familiar, rhythmic, soft, like a lullaby in reverse. Once the chores are set in motion, you lift your eyes to the sky. It's a habit. No one taught you to do this. The clouds are your weather vane, the wind your calendar. There's no storm today. The air smells of damp soil, not threat. Maybe a good day, maybe not. You've learned not to assume. You shoulder your tools, a hoe worn smooth, a basket with one handle mended twice. You don't go far. The land is stitched to your house like a sleeve to a coat. You walk down the path everyone uses, your footsteps joining the hundreds already packed into the earth. In the field, the rows wait familiar and endless. Your knees drop into the soil without a second thought. You weed. You thin. You shift rocks and pull roots and hope the barley's stubbornness is a sign of strength, not sickness. Somewhere nearby, a woman sings to herself, a tune you half know. You don't join in. You don't have the breath for it. The sun climbs. Your shirt sticks to your back. Your hands are lined with soil that no amount of rinsing will remove. You feel the sharp reminder of yesterday's blister reopening, but you keep going. The ground doesn't care if your skin is raw. When the light reaches its peak, you pause. Not for rest, not exactly, but to chew. You sit on the edge of a rock that's been there longer than memory. You tear into bread that's more brick than loaf. You sip from a flask of ale that tastes slightly sour, but it doesn't matter. It's enough. There's no talking, just chewing. A nod from someone across the rows. A glance at the sky. A small sigh that escapes before you catch it. Then the moment's gone and the tools are back in your hands. Afternoon drips by like honey. Thick, slow, reluctant. You mend a broken fence post. You patch the shed roof with branches and straw. You help a neighbour lift a stone from her cart. No task is refused. Help flows like breath given freely because it might be your turn to ask tomorrow. The kids play nearby, muddy knees and wild hair. They fight with sticks, chase hens, invent games you don't understand. They laugh like they've never been cold, like they've never known hunger. You smile without realizing. Then it fades. You go back to work. The sun starts falling. Shadows stretch long and slow across the paths. The chickens begin clustering near the coop. You move with them, gather eggs, check on the goat again, gather what little can be gathered. Inside the room glows gold from the fire's return. The stew is reheated, same one as yesterday and the day before. Thick at the bottom, watery on top. You dip a chunk of crust in and chew. It's not good. It's just food. That's enough. You eat in a circle, knees touching spoons, clinking elbows bumping. Someone hums, someone burps. Someone complains about a sore foot, a stubborn cow, a missing comb. The noise of family soft and unending. You scrape your bowl. You pass it on. You wipe your hands on the hem of your tunic and stretch. The ache in your shoulders is louder now. Children fall asleep like leaves falling off a tree, one then another, then a pair together. You tuck a cloth over them. You don't speak. The hush settles slowly, the kind of silence only earned by exhaustion. You stare at the fire until your eyes blur. Your thoughts don't drift far. You don't imagine castles or cities. You wonder if the beans will sprout, if the roof patch will hold, if the hens will lay again. That's dreaming enough. You sleep on a mattress of straw that smells of mould and memory. Someone shifts beside you. A hand lands on your hip. You don't move it. You fall asleep thinking of the same thing you always do tomorrow. Will it rain? Will the barley grow tall? Will the steward show up unannounced? But you push the questions away. You've earned this quiet. You've earned this warmth. The day will come, and when it does, you'll rise again. Not because you want to, not because it's fair, but because that's what you do. You keep going, and that somehow is enough. The rhythm of life in your village doesn't come from a clock or a calendar or the gentle chime of bells on the hour. It comes from your own body, from the creak in your knees as you crouch, from the calluses on your hands growing thick each season, from the way your breath fogs in winter and clings to your skin in the heat of July. And it comes from the people around you, because in this world, tight, close, shared, no life is ever really lived alone. Your home isn't just yours, it's a shared hearth, a crowded bed, a room that hums with quiet presence, even when no one's speaking. You live with your family, yes, your parents if they're still living, your children, if you've had any, maybe a grandparent, a sibling's child, an orphaned cousin. The word household doesn't mean privacy, it means necessity. There's no hallway, no doors to close behind you. Just the open space cluttered with lives folded into one another. In winter, even the animals come in. Not all of them, but the important ones, the goat if she's lactating, the piglets if the frost is cruel, the chickens if the coop's roof is leaking again. You complain about the smell, everyone does, but you also know it means warmth, it means meat someday, it means survival. And so you learn to live in layers, of wool, of obligation, of noise. You don't talk much during the day, not about feelings. Conversations are short, practical, about firewood and meals and fences that won't stand. But there's communication all the same, a glance that says, I saw what you did, a sigh that answers, I'm trying. At night, when the children fall asleep and the stew's gone cold, the world gets quieter. You can almost hear your own heart again. Sometimes you lie beside someone back to back and you both stare into the dark without saying a word. Not because you're angry, just because the words wouldn't add anything. Other times the stillness invites memory. You think of a brother who left the village 5 winters ago and never came back. Of a girl you kissed behind the chapel once who married a man 2 hills over. Of the time your mother's bread rose too high and spilled over the oven lip like a miracle. No one writes these things down. No one paints them in gold-leafed manuscripts, but they stay, carried in your body like old bruises, shared in stories murmured when the fire's low and everyone's too tired to keep pretending they're strong. That's what counts here, not pride, but endurance. When the village gathers, it's not for leisure. There is no pub, no marketplace, no holiday in the modern sense. But there are feast days, church-sanctioned respites from labour where for once the day begins not with work but with anticipation. You wear your least mended tunic. You wash your face more thoroughly. You braid your hair if there's time. The whole community comes together in a crooked line of mismatched shoes and patched cloaks. The priest blesses the gathering. Someone plays a crude flute. Children shriek with excitement. There might be bread sweetened with honey, a rare thing, and it disappears in moments. There might be a roast bird or a pie that no one quite remembers how to make properly. And there's laughter. Loud, real, giddy laughter. Because for one day, no one is collecting taxes. No one is measuring grain. No one is coughing blood in the corner of the hut. But even celebration has its script. The steward is watching. The Lord might arrive stiff on horseback, gaze sweeping over the people like a man scanning a field for weeds. You lower your eyes not out of fear exactly, but because it's easier than being noticed. When he leaves, a different kind of breath escapes one you didn't realize you were holding. Marriage in your world is rarely about love. It's about alignment of tools, of land, of bodies that might produce more labor. You don't choose in the way people now imagine choosing, but you hope for kindness, for someone who doesn't raise their voice, who remembers to patch the thatch before it rains, who listens when your daughter coughs at night. Sometimes, if you're lucky, affection grows after the vows, slowly like moss, quietly like the first snow that doesn't melt. It's not passion, but it's enough. Children arrive not as surprises, but as inevitabilities, one after another, sometimes with long silences in between, sometimes too close to breathe. Some live, some don't. You cry, you bury them, you go back to the fields. That's how it is. You try to teach them the things you know, how to tell good soil from bad, how to pluck a chicken without tearing the skin, how to know when someone's lying just by the way their eyes twitch. You hope they listen, you hope they remember. But children are like seeds. You plant them, you water them, but the growing, that's theirs to do. And as you grow older, something strange happens. You become the elder without ever quite realizing it. You start remembering the old ways before anyone else. You become the one asked about the best time to plant leeks, or whether this kind of cough is the bad kind. You're the one who remembers the name of the man who built the chapel roof, even if he's long gone. The one who knows which tree always blooms first in spring. You stop lifting heavy things. You stop tending the outer fields. Your knees ache too early in the morning and your fingers won't grip like they used to. But you're still needed. Your value changes from muscle to memory. You find yourself watching others do what you once did with ease, and some part of you aches not from pain but from longing, from the knowledge that the world is still turning without you at the center of it. That's how life is here. You don't retire, you fade. But you're not alone. You're never really alone. Even in the smallest hut, even in the quietest night, the sounds of life are always just beyond the door, a rooster crowing a neighbour, coughing a cart, creaking under a load of firewood. They remind you that the village is still breathing, that you're part of something, still. So you keep passing on what you know, through words, through gestures, through silences that teach as much as speeches. And one day when you're gone, someone else will remember how you always covered the pot just right, or that you said lentils made better stew than beans, or that your laugh sounded like thunder if it ever really let loose. There won't be a gravestone, but there will be stories, and in this world that's how people live on. There's a kind of wisdom that settles into your bones after decades on the land. Not the kind written down or passed through noble houses in bound books, but the sort learned with your hands, learned when a storm rolls in uninvited and tears the thatch free, learned when a child gets sick in the night and you know without needing a midwife to say it whether they'll wake again. It's quiet wisdom, rooted, worn like a second skin. That's what you carry now. You weren't taught it in a single moment. It came in fragments layered across the years like soot on the hearth wall. You learned that onions grow better if planted beside leeks, that wool dries faster if wrung before sunset, that goats will always eat the one thing you wanted to save. You learned not to trust the wind when it changes direction too quickly, and not to drink from the stream when the frogs go quiet. No one ever called it education, but it was. And now, in the later seasons of your life, people come to you for that knowledge. Not always directly. They don't knock and ask for advice, but you hear your words repeated in the mouths of younger folk. You see them planting where you once said the sun lingers longest. You see them choosing the path around the marsh even when it's longer, because someone told them long ago that the short way takes shoes. You're not flattered. You're relieved, because it means the village remembers that what you learned wasn't wasted, that the pain and the patience turned into something more than blisters. You still work, of course. No one stops working. But your days move slower. You find yourself watching more than doing. And what you watch increasingly is the next generation, the way they carry water, the way they argue with their own children, the way they laugh too loudly on feast days, not realizing how rare that sound can become. You smile more often, but you speak less. The young don't need reminders. They need room to stumble, just as you once did. The body, though, it doesn't ask your permission to change. One day you lift a basket and feel something snap. Another day the cold bites deeper than you remember. You stop kneeling to pray not because your faith has faded, but because getting up has become a negotiation with pain. You begin to measure your time not in years or seasons, but in aches, in which joints are stiffest in the morning, in how many times you rise in the night to relieve yourself, in the number of stairs to the loft that now feel like a mountain, and still you keep going. 'Cause that's what people do here. They don't stop. They don't retire to quiet gardens with warm bread and songs from grandchildren. They fade into their own shadows, gradually, gently, like the final coals of a long-burning fire. When you're no longer able to work the field, you mend things, you watch the fences, you tend the hearth, you sit with the dying and say the prayers they're too weak to say themselves, and when your time nears, you don't announce it. You just begin to speak in softer tones. You begin giving things away, your best bowl, the knife that still cuts the bit of wool you saved for winter. You bless more often. You smile longer. You sit outside more, watching the wind move across the barley. Your family notices, of course. They don't say anything either. But they bring you more broth. They stack the wood higher. They sit beside you without needing a reason. Death isn't a stranger here. It's a quiet visitor. A part of life like planting and harvest, and when it comes it doesn't knock, it simply enters. Your final days will be quiet. No great speeches, no tears drawn from crowds, just the settling of breath, the last bowl of warm broth, the rustle of straw as someone adjusts your blanket for the last time. The priest will come. He'll mumble the words that are supposed to smooth your passage. He might not remember your name exactly, but he'll try, and that will be enough. Your family will cry, but not loudly. They'll keep the fire lit. They'll wash your body. They'll dig the grave with hands that still ache from last year's harvest. They'll bury you in a place near others like you, near the old chapel under the crooked tree beside the path where the sheep pass in spring. There won't be a stone, but someone will plant flowers, and that will be enough. Because in this village, that's what memory looks like. But here's the strange part, even as your body fades, your presence lingers. Long after your name is no longer spoken, people will still stir the stew the way you did. They'll still swear that potatoes store better in the dark corner of the cellar. They'll still say, "Remember the old one who used to tell us that goats can smell rain." They might not recall your face, but they'll carry your habits, and that in its own way is immortality. You live on in the way the fire is stacked, in the way the bread is scored, in the way a lullaby is sung at just the right tempo to hush a restless child. This is your legacy. Not gold, not monuments, not titles carved into cold stone, but warmth, technique, kindness passed through gestures. And in a world like this, what else could you ask for? Because even when your story ends, the village continues. The fields turn green again, the sky grows heavy, the sheep bleat at sunrise, and a child somewhere, one who never met you, laughs at the same joke you once told your brother a lifetime ago. The village endures, and so do you. There's a certain kind of rhythm that settles into your life when the seasons shape your every action. Not just a calendar rhythm not marked in dates or appointments, but a rhythm of air and soil, of temperature and birdsong, of how much daylight is left in your fingers when you finish tying the last bundle of firewood. It's the sort of rhythm that teaches you to listen more than speak, to observe more than plan. By now your life is paced by this rhythm, and even if you don't think of it in words, your body knows the pulse of the land. When the frost clings tighter to the window panes, you reach for the thicker cloak. When the air takes on a certain sweetness, you know the plums won't last much longer. When the wind blows from the east and the sheep huddle closer than usual, you double-check the roof. It's not superstition, it's survival. Spring begins not with a date, but with the smell of thawed earth, with the first tiny shoots of green that dare poke up from the frost-hardened ground. The snow recedes in ragged patches and the village begins to stir in a new way. Children kick at the softening mud. You test the spade against the soil, not to till yet, but just to see. You never celebrate too early. Spring is a trickster. A false thaw can come, warm your bones, tease your garden awake, and then vanish beneath another bitter frost. So you wait, you mend what winter frayed. You patch clothes, you clean tools, you sweep out the corners where the wind whispered secrets all season. And when you're certain, not because the calendar says so, but because your gut agrees with the birdsong, you begin. The planting is cautious, seeds are precious. Each one carries the weight of meals not yet cooked, mouths not yet fed. You press them into the soil gently like a prayer. You don't look for miracles, you look for moisture, for shade, for balance. The work is long. Bent backs, tired hands, dirt under every fingernail. You don't call it toil, it's just life. And beneath your touch, the world begins to respond. Summer brings more light than you know what to do with. It wakes you early and lingers long past supper. The days stretch, the chores multiply. Every path seems to demand your attention. The roof that sags, the goat that limps, the fence that buckles. There is no rest, but there is beauty. The world feels alive in a way winter can't compete with. The fields ripple with barley and hope. Bees hum with lazy confidence. Wildflowers sprout in places you've never seen them before. You sweat not out of misery, but movement. The kind of sweat that feels earned. Meals grow simpler. Bread, cheese, whatever the garden offers. But there's satisfaction in eating something that grew from your own patch of earth. Even the blandest stew tastes better when you saw the first leaf sprout yourself. By midsummer, the heat is relentless. You keep water near. You try not to complain. Complaining doesn't cool the sun, and anyway, it's better than the cold. The children run barefoot. The elders sit in the shade. The rest of you work and try not to think about how quickly summer can turn, because it does slowly then all at once. The days shorten. A certain crispness enters the air, a bite at dawn that wasn't there last week. The trees begin to change, not loudly, just one yellow leaf at a time. And just like that, autumn is here. Autumn is busy. You harvest fast because the sky doesn't wait. You pull carrots by the dozen. You twist onions from the dirt, lay them out to dry. You wrap apples in straw, hoping they'll last. You count. Not for wealth, but for certainty, how many jars, how many sacks, how many mouths everyone works. The village becomes a place of movement. Carts, creaking, baskets, swinging voices calling out over the wind. The feasts come modest but sincere. There's laughter again. Ull flows. Bread breaks between hands. Stories are told. But even in joy there's calculation. You notice how many potatoes you've put aside, how thin the goat looks this year, whether the rye sprouted too short, because winter is always listening, and winter comes. Not always with snow, sometimes just with silence, with the way the birds disappear, with how the mornings feel like bruises, with the first fire that smokes too much because the wood is still damp. You put on another layer. You wrap your feet in cloth. You light the fire and keep it alive. Winter is waiting. You stay inside more. You sit by the hearth and mend and talk and fall silent and stir the same pot twice, just to give your hand something to do. There's a slowness that wraps itself around the village, a hush. Even the dogs sleep more, even the wind sounds lonelier. Some nights you lie awake and listen not for danger, just for signs, a branch tapping, a drip, a sigh from the rafters. You don't fear them. They're familiar now, like neighbours who've moved in and never left. When the snow comes, if it comes, it is both beautiful and brutal. It blankets the world, erasing paths and hiding firewood. The roof groans under the weight. The door sticks. The cold presses in through every crack. But the snow also quiets everything. It hushes the world into a strange peace. And inside, life continues. You teach the children to play with twine and shadows. You tell stories, the same ones your parents told you and theirs before that. You explain the meaning of the stars as best you can, and when you don't know, you make something up that sounds true. That's what stories are for. Food grows simpler. Bread broth may be an onion saved from rot. You chew slower. You talk less while eating. There's nothing to waste, not time, not words, not crumbs. You sweep the corners. You count the jars again. The hardest part of winter isn't the cold. It's the waiting. The knowing that there's still more of it ahead. That the snow might thaw and return. That the sun might shine but not warm. That your strength might not hold as long as your need. But somehow it does. Because spring always comes again. Eventually the frost recedes. The paths reappear. The chickens start laying again. The sheep lose their winter coats. You open the shutters just a crack and let the new light in, and you begin again. The rhythm of the seasons is not a circle exactly, it's a spiral. Each year brings you back to the same tasks but never the same way. You're older, wiser, maybe slower, maybe kinder. The land remembers you, and you in return remember it. This endless cycle is not a burden. It is a song. A long, slow song with no end and no beginning. And if you've learned the tune well enough, you can hum it to the next person, the next child, the next soul who will carry the torch forward. That more than anything else is what keeps the village alive. Not the buildings, not the laws, not the lords or the coins or the parchments, but the passing down of rhythm, of knowledge, of care, one season at a time. There's a kind of inheritance that doesn't come written in ink or sealed with wax. It doesn't sit in vaults or change hands in loud public ceremonies. It's quieter, slower handed down like a wool cloak that still smells faintly of smoke, or a prayer whispered in the same cadence your grandmother once used. In the medieval countryside, this inheritance was everything. You didn't inherit land not unless your lord allowed it. You didn't inherit titles you weren't of that world. What you inherited was knowledge, the kind that lived in calloused hands and weather-creased faces, the kind that couldn't be written down because no one had parchment, and even if they did, most couldn't read it. You learned by doing, by watching, by repeating. You learned how to braid onions so they'd store longer, how to mend a fence with whatever was nearby, how to spot when the cow was about to calve or when the wind was turning cruel. You learned which plant eased fevers and which one might just kill you. You learned to tell the time not by clocks there were none, but by the shadows of trees, the feel of the soil, the sound of the crows, and you passed it on. To your children, to your neighbour's child, when her mother was sick, to the quiet boy who asked too many questions but always helped gather eggs. You didn't teach in lessons. You taught in gestures, in habits, in the rhythm of the day. Do it like this, you'd say, and then you'd show them. There were no diplomas, no exams, no graduates, only people who knew, and people who watched until they did too. Stories were part of this inheritance, not the grand myths of kings and gods, but local ones, practical ones. The kind that told you which family once tried planting peas too early and lost their whole crop to frost. The kind that warned of the bog where someone's uncle sank up to his chest and had to be pulled out with rope and prayer. The kind that remembered the year of the great sickness, the year the rye turned black, the year the steward took 2 pigs instead of 1. These weren't just tales. They were warnings, instructions, maps for survival hidden inside memory. And then there were the values, the things you carried that didn't weigh down your sack but shaped every choice you made. You learned to share because no one had enough to hoard. You learned to be silent when someone was grieving and loud when the stew finally boiled over. You learned to celebrate small things, a dry roof, a good egg, a song that made the babies stop crying. You learned patience because the weather didn't care if you were tired of waiting. Respect was a currency, not the kind you used to buy favour from the Lord that required grain and obedience, but the kind you used with each other. You respected the old woman with 3 teeth because she still spun better wool than anyone. You respected the boy who limped because he always brought in more firewood than expected. You respected the land because it could kill you if you didn't. Your worldview was small, not because you lacked imagination, but because it had to be. You had no maps, no compasses, no sense of where the sun went after it dipped behind the hills, but you knew the shape of the field outside your door. You knew which tree leaned like it was whispering something. You knew the feel of the path between home and well, every stone, every rut. That was your world. And inside it you carved meaning. There were rituals passed down without anyone calling them rituals. Stirring the stew a certain way, hanging herbs above the lintel every midsummer, whispering a name before planting the first seed. Not because you expected magic, but because it felt wrong not to. Because your mother did it, and her mother before her. Belief wasn't separate from life, it was woven through it. You didn't go to church just to listen. You went to remember, to belong, to see who else was still alive and still holding on. And when the priest mumbled in Latin, you didn't understand the words, but you understood the weight. You understood that this too was a kind of passing down. Language was inherited too, not just in the way you spoke, but in the way you shaped your thoughts. You said things like, if the wind allows, or God willing, because control was a myth and everyone knew it. You didn't say, I will do this. You said, I'll try unless the cow calves early, or the roof falls in, or the stew catches fire again. Even your dreams were inherited. You dreamed of better weather, better harvests. Maybe once in a while of going to the next town and seeing if the bread really tasted different there. You dreamed of your children staying healthy, of no one knocking on your door with a ledger, of a quiet life that wasn't quite so heavy. You didn't dream of thrones or riches or ships that crossed the sea. Those dreams belonged to other people. People who had coin and maps and boots without holes. You dreamed within the bounds of your world, and even those dreams were fragile. But they mattered, because they were yours. Sometimes you inherited grief, not just in the people you lost, but in the burdens they carried that didn't end with them. Debts, illness, reputation. You might be judged for something your father did or failed to do. You might find the steward's eyes lingering longer than they should when he reads your name. And yet there was also joy, small flickering stubborn joy, the kind that came when a calf stood up for the first time, when the bread rose better than expected, when someone laughed so hard they spilled their ale and didn't even care. These were not the joys of feasts or triumphs, but they were real, and they reminded you that life even in hardship had moments worth keeping. Some of what you inherited you hoped to change. You told yourself your children would be better off, that they'd have more potatoes stored, that they wouldn't have to watch the sky with the same clenched jaw, that maybe they'd learn to read or at least know someone who did. You worked for those hopes. You saved what you could. You whispered stories a little softer in case they listened closer. You pointed at the stars even if you didn't know their names, because wonder was also something worth passing down. In time, you became the one others looked to. The one who remembered the hard frost of 13. The one who knew how to fix a torn boot with thread and faith. The one who could tell whether the stew had enough salt just by smell. You didn't ask for that role. It just arrived, like the seasons, like age, and when someone asked, "How do you know?" you didn't explain. You just smiled and said, "I was taught." And maybe that's the truest inheritance of all. Not the knowledge itself, but the understanding that you are part of a chain, not a golden one, not unbroken, not always fair, but a chain nonetheless. One link passing to the next. A quiet living record of how to stay alive, stay kind, stay human, in a world that often asks too much. This was the real wealth of the village, not the fields, not the coin, not even the harvest, but the people, the way they remembered, the way they taught, the way they carried each other through one gesture, one habit, one story at a time. The sun doesn't rise quickly in a medieval village. It stretches itself slow across the thatched roofs, hesitates behind the misty tree-lined filters, cautiously through the smoke curling up from a half-stirred hearth. Morning isn't announced by alarm or trumpet, but by the sound of feet shuffling toward chores, by a rooster who always crows too early, by the creak of a door pulled open with hands that already ache. And yet each morning still matters. Each one is a quiet declaration we are still here. In a world so unforgiving where weather sickness, hunger and power could all take without asking, survival wasn't just existence, it was persistence. A resistance not against lords or laws, but against surrender. Each fire rekindled, each pot of stew reheated, each fence post straightened. All of them acts of defiance dressed in the mundane. There were no memoirs written, no histories recorded in ink, but lives were written in footprints across muddy fields, worn paths between home and well-deep ruts near the shed where the goats gathered. In these traces lay the true record of your days. Your calendar wasn't on a wall, it was in the tasks. February meant patching the roof, April meant shearing sheep, October meant gathering acorns, December meant praying the firewood would last. Your year was a wheel, not a line, always circling, always returning. You measured life in harvest, in full bellies, in winters survived. And when you spoke of time, you didn't say 10 years ago. You said before the harsh frost or after Mary died. Because that's what time really was, moments marked by memory, not math. You didn't think of your life as small. You didn't think of it as anything, really. You were too busy living it. You didn't wake up pondering your place in the world. You woke up because the pig was squealing, or the baby had a cough, or someone knocked on the door asking to borrow kindling. Philosophy came later, if at all, and usually around the fire between sips of weak ale, as someone wondered aloud why the moon sometimes looked angry. There were moments for reflection, sure, a funeral, a wedding, a birth, but even these didn't pull you far from the soil. They were milestones, not revelations. You cried, you laughed, you worried, and then you got back to work. Because life didn't pause for sentiment. Even joy was practical. A good crop didn't bring celebration, it brought relief. A mended roof didn't spark pride, it sparked sleep. A neighbour's joke was funny not because it was clever, but because it distracted you from the fact that your boots hadn't dried in 3 days. Laughter was medicine, so was song. You sang while working, even if just under your breath. Old songs mostly. Songs your parents sang. Some about saints, some about cows, some about things that didn't make sense anymore but still sounded right. They stitched your days together, humming through your fingers as you pulled weeds, as you scrubbed pots, as you sat on the step waiting for dusk. The lullabies were ancient. The harvest tunes older still. You didn't know who first sang them. You didn't need to. They belonged to everyone, like the wind, like the path to the stream, like the knowledge of when the sky meant rain. You may not have had many words for what you felt, but you felt everything deeply. The shame of letting stew burn, the pride of a straight furrow, the worry that your child coughed too hard in the night, the joy when your neighbour brought back honey, the fear when a stranger knocked and didn't smile, the gratitude when your goat birthed 2 kids instead of 1, the ache when your hands, once nimble, dropped the needle. There were no journals, but you remembered. And when someone asked, you'd say, "The year the frost killed the rye, I was just a girl." Or it was the spring after the baker's barn caught fire. The past wasn't locked behind dates, it was carried in feeling. Your faith too wasn't dissected or debated. It was worn, like an old cloak, frayed, patched, essential. You prayed when you planted. You prayed when someone was sick. You prayed when nothing else made sense. Not because you expected miracles you didn't, but because not praying felt like leaving the door open in a storm. You crossed yourself out of habit, not superstition. You believed because belief gave your sorrow a place to go. And you believed in other things too, in fairness even if it didn't always arrive, in kindness even when it cost you, in the power of salt rosemary and a kind word at the right time, in the truth of dreams and the weight of promises, in the idea that if you kept doing your part, the planting, the mending, the feeding, the forgiving, the world would not fall apart. And somehow it didn't. It bent, it creaked, it leaned a little too far into winter sometimes, but it held, and so did you. You endured not because you were built for suffering, but because you were stubborn. Because something in you refused to give up even when the fire wouldn't catch and the stew was thin and your back screamed with every movement. You kept going, not in glory, not in song, but in grit. That was enough. History forgets peasants because peasants weren't loud. They didn't write treatises or lead revolutions, not often anyway. They didn't build cathedrals, though they quarried the stone. They didn't sign treaties, though they paid the taxes. They didn't wear crowns, though they buried those who did. But without them there would have been nothing. No harvest to feed kings, no cloth to robe bishops, no hands to raise walls, no hearts to carry traditions forward. They were the steady hum beneath the grandeur, the heartbeat of a world that pretended not to need them but always did. And they survived. That alone deserves remembering, because survival isn't passive. It's a choice made every day to rise to tend to hope even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. So if you ever find yourself walking through an old village, half-forgotten stones sunken into grass walls bowed with time pause, listen. You might hear them still. The whisper of a child learning to tie straw into rope, the murmur of a woman telling a story while kneading dough, the scrape of a hoe on dry soil, the laugh of a man who just got a fire started on the first try, the creak of a door that's been mended 5 times and still swings open anyway. They're gone, yes, but they built the path you walk on. Every step of yours echoes of theirs, and if you remember that even once, then they are not forgotten, they're simply waiting.